Here we are.
Excellent. Welcome to our virtual summit. This is the last session of the last day. We hope that if you've been part of any of the earlier sessions that you have, taken away a lot of new ideas and energy for your work and have found some new people to connect with. For our session, just a few housekeeping things. If it's possible, please leave your camera on. We love to see your faces and reactions and engage with each other. If you could keep your microphone off unless you are speaking, and we have, please feel free to comment, introduce yourself, the organization you're from, and any questions in the chat. We will continuously be monitoring that throughout this session, particularly since this session is really meant to be a conversation. Also, given that it is meant to be a conversation, and as is the case with all of our sessions, this is a safe space. Feel free to please be respectful, please be open. This is a place where we do want to have some of those hard questions unpacked a little bit. And lastly, we hope you'll join us for some of our upcoming events. We'll pop that slide up towards the end of the session today, but we have an awards dinner coming up. We have more training for our C-level, managerial, exec level professionals in the travel and tourism space, and all manner of other great resources to share with you. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Roni Weiss, our executive director, who will be leading us through a session that goes beyond the basics of discussing some of the tough DEI questions that we encounter in the work that we do. And again, please keep populating the chat with any questions and anything you'd like to have discussed during this session. Roni, over to you.
Thank you, Ami. Thank you, everybody, for being here. So, to Ami's point, one, I have no intention of talking for 56 minutes. If there are things that you want me to talk about or whatever, fine. But I would much rather, as Ami said, this is a discussion. We also, to that point, you can type stuff in chat to Ami, Brianna, or me directly if you don't want to say it on here, and we can pause or stop the recording as needed, depending on where we need or want the conversation to go. So, before I get to a bunch of slides and all of that, let's start here, which is what haven't we talked about over the past 3 days? Is there anything that you specifically want addressed? Is there something specific that you want to bring up? Or even for the discussions we've had, is there something sticking with you? This is your space and your time for anything. And if this becomes the rest of our time today, then wonderful. So here we are. Give it a couple more seconds. Got plenty of things I could share, but again, would much rather it's about things that are top of mind to you. All right. So let's start with me and my dad and my brother, who haven't been in these slides before. So I'm in New York, have 4 kids, ages 11 and below, diagnosed with ADD as a kid, which comes into this identity stuff. We've talked a bit about disability, neurodiversity, and neurodivergence. I don't know if it was brought up explicitly as a term these past 3 days. And I've been to different places. So Travel Unity, in the context of what we're talking about, again, for those who might not be as familiar, been around since 2016. Our focus is about how do we make travel welcoming to everybody. We have an alliance, and part of the reason I bring that up is because every month we have discussions like these with guest speakers, and to the point of training, we have our 3 levels of individual DEI certifications and 4 levels of organizational. So starting with this, what should be done around the pushback regarding the term DEI? I was invited to speak at Kentucky Travel Industry Association under pretty much exactly these auspices of what about the pushback around DEI, which would is DEI dying, all those sorts of things. And this is how I started my whole presentation, which is that it doesn't matter what the term is. For Travel Unity, and I guess I'll talk about this quickly in terms of why we use DEI and not other acronyms. But we use DEI because it makes sense to us as an organization. Diversity is just reality. Our definition of diversity is that there are people of different identities. That is, regardless of where you are, a fact. For us, inclusion is because diversity doesn't necessarily mean that you're including everybody. This, for anybody who's done even the most basic DEI stuff, is all very rudimentary. What is different that I found in how Travel Unity looks at DEI is about the E, because when we look at equity, yes, it's equity, not equality, meaning it's about giving people opportunities and making it about them. But for us, equity is also about the structures involved, meaning how are you putting in processes, procedures? How are you making sure that there is a continuity of what you're doing? The reason we don't include B for belonging is because ultimately you as an organization can't control it. You can do all the most wonderful things, but um, the belonging, somebody might not feel like they belong for a variety of reasons. So, yes, the goal and the hope is belonging, but we as an organization talk about that as a hope and goal, but don't include it in the acronym. Accessibility, a lot of people in the disability space um, feel like they're not included in this because a lot of times the DEI conversations is specifically about race and ethnicity, and potentially, gender expression, LGBTQ, sexual orientation, those sorts of things. So sometimes accessibility and disability is not brought up, so people want to emphasize that. To us, it should be part of it, which is why we're not emphasizing it. And then the last letter in these that comes up is justice. We had a session around it, and as you could tell, an hour of talking about justice, decolonization, all those sorts of things. It's a very high bar, and for most organizations, they can't meet that. So I think justice is a term to be very careful about. But overall, the point being, there you go. There's terminology. It doesn't matter what you say or don't say. What matters is what you're actually doing. So if you're in a space where people are pushing against DEI, I would not let that be the barrier to doing the work. What you need to do is make sure that you're doing the work. And I would even go so far as to say DEI means you're listening to the people you're engaging with. So if the people you're working with are uncomfortable with the term DEI, it is DEI to use different terminology. Big question that we get, especially because we work in a lot of rural parts of the country that are, predominantly white, is how do we, as an organization or as a destination, do DEI if we're not diverse? And to be frank, I think that the question shows, this kind of initial discrepancy about what diversity means, right? What they really mean, and I think it's very important to say what we mean and mean what we say, is what they mean is that they're white. They mean that there are not people of color in their organization for the most part. I can't think of, in all honesty, in the years I've been doing this, anytime that some version of this question came up where it wasn't specifically about, again, a rural, very white destination or a staff where it's all white. I think, yes, having racial and ethnic diversity is good. It's important. It's something to think about. But I think it loses sight of this work the way this is framed. Again, if you want to be specific and say we need to be more racially or ethnically diverse, well, there's two sides to it. One is on the organizational side, there's more you can do in terms of outreach and thinking about when you're doing recruitment, when you're doing interviews, what are the ways you're dealing with bias, dealing with awareness and things like that. But the reality is when you're within a space in terms of the population itself, there's not a lot that a DMO, a hotel, a tour company can do to change the whole demographics of where they're at. So I think first, broadening what you mean and being specific about what you mean is important because that's how you actually make strides on this. Yeah, I think that that's a big part of what's going on here. That people need to broaden what they mean. I think the one point of caution though is people who lean on certain aspects like gender because they'll be like, oh well, we're very gender balanced because we have men and women in the organization, or they'll be like, we have all women, we're doing diversity really well. It's like, no, that's not the argument to be made here either. So I think there's some complexity here. The last point I wanted to make was to be very careful about the term BIPOC if it's not what you actually mean. I think a lot of times people say BIPOC because they're not comfortable saying black, and it's not the same thing. If you're saying BIPOC, you are talking about black, indigenous, and people of color. You're talking about a wide array of people. If really you're talking about black travelers, you're talking about black owned businesses, things like that, be very specific and clear that that is what you mean, because it's condescending, it's inaccurate, and it's confusing. So that those are some thoughts on that topic. Well, right. We as an organization are focused on applied DEI. How do you actually do this work consistently? That's what. Thank you, Najana. Najana, you want to come on and say anything on this, since I know this is a topic you care about too?
Oh, sure. Hey, everyone. Just kind of
You want to
backtracking.
do
I
a quick
wanted,
intro, or I mean, just
oh,
title and
sure.
stuff, so people know context?
Yes. Hey, y'all. I am Najana White, VP of DEI at Miles Partnership. We had a great panel on day one. And so I wanted to kind of raise that point in the chat where Ronnie just said, but oftentimes what we see when we're consulting or just in conversation with other people in the industry is that sometimes there's a level of discomfort in the language of DEI. Ronnie, I think you and I had this conversation earlier this year when we were talking about, okay, how do we talk about all the acronyms, all the letters, like all the things? And so oftentimes when people are putting together campaigns, marketing strategies, like we just heard from Visit Detroit, how you're talking about the community and the people that actually live there has to be some level of comfort in the discomfort. So who are you trying to market to? I'll go back to what Ronnie said on day one if you're not here, but who is telling this story really well? Whoever that audience is, you have to be comfortable with talking to that audience. So specifically, if you are talking, just like Ronnie said, to Black travelers, what does that experience look like? And how are you visualizing that story? If you are talking to Black travelers in a Black family, it is okay if you don't have a mixed race family in your visuals. It's okay to just have a Black family show up and have experiences. It's okay to have, the audience not only experiencing food and drink, but experiencing luxury and other types of um, different additives in your destination. So I just wanted to add that because I feel like that's a hard part in DEI, specifically if someone even tells us like, hey, we are looking for a LGBTQ plus couple. That's great, but what are you looking for? Let's get more specific. It's okay to say the words so we can help you get what you need to tell the story in an authentic way, in a way that resonates with who you want to talk to.
That was great. Thank you, Najana. Um, I lost what I was going to say. I'll probably remember in a second. Thank you. So, how do we actually do this work? Ah, right. I remember what I was going to say. I was going to say is on the last panel, they brought up MMGY and the Hispanic Traveler Study. So Travel Unity was a part of the whole arc of that. And there was a whole controversy because initially it was going to be a Latinx study. That was the name. Um, and I'm not going to go into all the concerns there, but I think the bigger point by the end was Hispanic was the right name, because when the respondents were asked how they self-identified, by a great portion, Hispanic was how they described themselves. So, when it comes to Hispanic, Latino, Latine, Latinx, all of that, I think the easiest thing on that, getting kind of very granular, is are you talking about language or are you talking about geography? Because if you're talking about Spanish speaking, well, Hispanic is what that means. Are you including Brazilians in what you're talking about? If so, then Latin, Latino, all of that, because that's based on geography. So, to what Najana was saying, and what I was saying before Najana was saying it, is it's about specificity. It's about knowing who you're talking to and who you're talking about. And that's where those studies can help, whether you're specific to your local community or whether you're looking to these bigger projects that have analyzed how people see themselves. Because the reality is, even if a great majority of people see themselves as Hispanic and that's how they self-title, there's going to be some portion who are within that demographic because identities are not a monolith where it's not going to speak to them. So how do we do this work? How do we not just keep talking about it? So there's two terms that I think are very important that Travel Unity uses. The first is what we call the foundational commitment, which means is that travel should be for everybody. So once you make that commitment, it's a succession of things to be done, some obvious, some not, um, where you're thinking about how to be welcoming to everybody within these different aspects. Another thing that I find very important in these discussions, going back to what I just said about people not necessarily agreeing with the terms you're using, is this term we have, diplomatic empathy. And the point of diplomatic empathy is that you know where you're coming from. So again, in this case, with the term Hispanic, you go, okay, well, we're talking to Spanish speakers. That's what Hispanic means. And there's a study that MMGY put out that said the majority of these travelers define themselves as Hispanic. Well, based on that, that would be a reasonable explanation as to why you use Hispanic. Well, somebody else comes to you and says, no, you should use this other term, Latinx, Latina, whatever. The way you do diplomatic empathy is you know where you're coming from, you listen to them, you hear their point of view, and if you can meet them part of the way, great. And if you can't, best case is kind of you agree to disagree. So I think what's important here is in some cases, you're going to have that very well defined where you're coming from. In other cases, you're not. And it's okay to tell them, that's really interesting. Thank you. I want to go back, talk to my team, whatever, as long as you go back to them and follow up with meeting them where they're at, explaining why you can't. But really, because identities are not monoliths, because this work always changes, I wouldn't even call it mistakes necessarily. It's really disagreements and different points of view. And given that, you need to be ready to talk to people about those different perspectives and be accepting the fact that sometimes you're not going to find a middle ground. Another way to do the work is to increasingly understand where other people are coming from. It is not enough to do the golden rule where you go, oh, well, this is what I want. The reality is, if you don't have that lived experience, it's very difficult to kind of conceptualize it on your own. The more we hear from other people, the more we understand what their concerns are around safety, around belonging, around representation, the more we can actually do the things that they need and are looking for. So, as I said before, DEI is about belonging. That's the goal, because the only way for people to have optimal experiences is if they feel safe, they feel included, they feel like they belong. Whether you're in the workplace, you're in a community, or you're a traveler, if you don't feel like people care about you, and certainly if you don't feel safe, there's no way you're going to be like, wow, this is great. So that's the only way we can get to that point of actually feeling, and that, Casey, that's exactly why we like videos, because I got to see you actually reacting to that. So thank you for being on video. That's, you can't be like, wow, I felt like everybody hated that I went to this place and it was such a great experience. Like, you have to be such a specific kind of person that I don't even know that I know that person for that to be what you're looking for in a travel experience or in a workplace for that matter. So we have to think about these things around safety. We have to think about these things around belonging. Again, the workplace, our communities, especially if we have tourism product around them, and then our travelers themselves. All right, apply DEI. How do we do this work? To me, I find that some folks in the DEI world fall short because they are either 100% or 80% or 90%, whatever percent, focused on the left side and not setting people up for success on the right side. Meaning that it's a lot about our identities, which are important. It's a lot about privilege, which we need to understand, but it doesn't say what to do with it. We go, okay, well, we need to understand, what does LGBTQ stand for? Okay, cool. Well, what are you going to do with that information, right? So it's important for us to do both of these things, to have that empathy, to understand people, but also that we're going to do something about it. And going back to DEI, inclusion isn't enough, because if we rest solely on charismatic, empathetic leadership, and muscle memory is the term I use, it's not going to continue the institutional memory. You need to have it that people know how to do this stuff. Otherwise, things fall to the wayside. Um, Now, one thing that came up, Ami and I ran a TDP session out in Oregon last week, I think. And in it, um, we were talking about turnover, which I think is a really interesting point that I don't know has come up explicitly in this way of processing. If you have turnover of staff, well, you have to train them and all of that. So yes, that's part of the reason for having standard operating procedures and training and all of that. But I think one core part of training that came out of that discussion that I think is really important is having people have the confidence and the training to be able to tell people that they don't know the answer, but they will find it out. Because when you have staff who are either making things up or telling people no, or just kind of closing down the conversation, it doesn't move things along. It doesn't help whomever it is. It's okay for people who are new to not know the answers. It's natural. But what we need to do within this process kind of paradigm is understand that that person needs to know where to go for those answers, because otherwise that's going to be its own kind of issue. And they need to be trained and supported in the fact that it's okay to tell people you don't know, as long as you find the answer and get back to them. Everything we do on this work is around our DEI standards. So for those who've seen me talk about this before, I'm not going to talk about it any differently, because it's kind of core to who we are. So leadership and workforce starts with this idea around organizational commitment. What that means is, what is your mission? Why do you exist as an organization? And then from there, how are you building a DEI commitment, both public facing and internally? And what that means within that is that you are stating something that you are going to stand behind. So on your website, on your About Us, whatever that looks like. But then also that you're having structures in place internally to continue the work. I actually was just talking to somebody today who wanted to hear about what was in common with organizations that have been doing this work well. And I'll tell you what I shared to him about what I saw as the kind of timeline of what I see of these organizations that do this work well. The first step is that there is a champion or champions within an organization. Meaning there's somebody who says we need to be doing DEI more, whatever it is. And again, that could be one person, but a lot of times it ends up being people who talk to each other, whatever it is. There's one person or multiple people who care about this. From there, there's then a DEI committee of some kind. Maybe that's not the name of it, but there's a group that regularly talks about this work. And if you're a small enough team and you can operationalize it right away, maybe your whole team is effectively serving as that. But there's a regular kind of continuity of people talking about the work. Then from there, they start coming up with how to action it, because it's not enough to start just talk about it. And those little successes are what start making it be more clear what this work actually is. And at that point, you can share it with a board, you could share it with the rest of the team, whatever it is, you're starting to be able to explain to yourself and other people what the success is around this work. Then from there, in my experience with different organizations, they start working with us. So I'm not saying that somebody has to work with us, but to have a deeper dive on understanding the entire day-to-day staff of, do they care about this work? What do they think the organization is doing around this work? So that's what we do in our phase one. Our phase one of consulting work is 3 steps or 3 parts. One is surveys or interviews to understand the day-to-day team's work on this. We look at the HR practices and we look at the marketing collateral to see what does representation look like around that. So again, at this point, I would say that you are bringing in an outside organization. Again, doesn't have to be us, but somebody who can do that deeper assessment. The next step that we do is we start doing trainings and having discussions with the different departments. So again, doesn't have to be us, but you're starting to action it within the whole organization. And I think that's the pivot point where you've gone from a few people talking about it to now we're starting to have the whole staff trained on this. And we're starting to make sure that every department is having these conversations. And then from there, expanding out to boards, stakeholders, supply chain, and then getting into the different identities you're thinking of and demographics and going into that deeper dive that you probably have already done to some degree, but now you have a kind of greater awareness of intersecting identities as it comes to this work. So you're not just thinking about people within these silos, but you have a broader perspective on identity. So that's a little detour from the standards. With the standards themselves, starts with that commitment, then the whole life cycle of employment, then with pillar B, how are you engaging with the community, your stakeholders, your supply chain, residents, and if all of us need to have an industry that's able to hire people. So workforce development is a part of that too. And then travelers, how are we thinking about the customers in all of this, which really can be anybody within humanity. So how are we making sure they're having positive experiences? How are we looking at our communications, like marketing collateral? And then how are we advocating for travelers? So this relates to, the actionable advocacy session that we had for those who were there. How are we thinking about how to be welcoming to different kinds of people? And legislation is a part of that. So the travel industry generally is not the ones writing that legislation. I mean, there's a little nuance there, but we need to be thinking about what the laws are and where we're at. And we're not going to be necessarily protesting outside of, the state capitol with signs as those organizations, but we can be talking to folks in elected government. And that's part of the relationship that we have. And if we're not advocating for the needs of travelers as the travel industry, who will? So I will pause there. I saw a few.
I wanted to reflect a little bit of what's going on in the chat. Helen brought up the point about it's about the culture of the organization, and David had a question regarding that. Forming a DEI mindset is about culture, and how do you embed DEI values into an organization's culture?
So I would thank you for both those things, and I certainly will let both of you chime in if you want to after I, ramble a bit. So the first thing I would say is that most people are in this industry because they care about people, they like people, they're curious about people, they're interested in people. So I think that there's, for the most part, a philosophical alignment with this work and this industry. So the values themselves might already be there. I think sometimes they're not necessarily emphasized, or people are using kind of standard definitions of things rather than having that discussion themselves. So I think it's always important to have that reset on the values within an organization, to have that discussion to make sure that people are aligning. So whether it's in that whole life cycle that I was talking about, whether it's part of strategic planning, at some point to be able to go, who are we as an organization, and is this represented in terms of the values that we're espousing, I think is the way to start. Now, that's a commitment. That's something on your wall. That's something on your website. I think the real way to do the value side is to make sure that you are connecting those values with the actual work you're doing. So how are you not just claiming that these are your values, but actually living those? And I think the gap here, a lot of times is because people very reasonably, let's say, but also very not reasonably, want to have huge successes around this work. Because ultimately, what we're talking about are societal issues. Hopefully, that's been clear over the past few days. We're talking about original sins from generations ago. So there's a grandiosity to what this work is, can, and should be. But when it comes down to it, having color blindness glasses, for people to be able to have experiences with a tourism product, that's the real work. Being able to just sit around and kind of intellectualize about this is nice that we get to do it, but it's the little things. It's those little kind of experiences that we have, and it's the specificity that to me are really doing it. I would say embedding values for too many organizations, in my perspective, is an exercise in a classroom, in a conference room, in a whatever, and it's not always tied to actually doing the work. So I'll start with Helen if you want to add anything on the culture side.
So you're putting me on the spot, but I was actually, while you're talking, I was thinking about Harriet again, and you know, the fact that they are creating in Detroit a culture around tourism that is very inclusive. And I think that you know, the leadership, so Harriet and others who are leading that charge, that's the modeling that they're doing, and they're operationalizing it and activating it within the community. I think within organizations, um, I you know, I don't like to always talk about leadership, but leaders are stewards of culture, and they have to model that behavior, and they have to model it in their actions and in their words. And when an organization begins to, I made that comment, let me just quickly go back, when you were talking about the training, and you were saying that it should be okay to make a mistake. And you should know where, you know, you shouldn't feel like, you know, oh my God, you know, what's going to happen to me? Because if you have a culture that says it's okay, ask questions, get the answers that you need, that and that makes you better for the next time. That's if that's your dominant culture, everyone's going to feel that. But I think sometimes it's really checking what your dominant culture is, what that messaging is, because a lot of times people are left out. There's one quick quote I want to share that I've kind of taken on about culture. It's from an article back in 2017 in Harvard Business Review. The quote is, "Culture is like the wind. It is invisible, yet its effects can be seen and felt. When it's blowing in your direction, it makes for smooth sailing. When it's blowing against you, everything is more difficult." And I think it's really important to recognize that within an organization, some people are good with what's the dominant culture, and others are, it's really difficult to be there. They don't feel that sense of belonging or inclusion. So I think from a leadership perspective, and leaders at every level, they need to recognize how the culture is impacting their team members and address that. And again, going back to leading by modeling behaviors and language, et cetera, that everyone is kind of speaking the same language and feeling good within an organization. I didn't explain that really well, but that's what I was thinking about.
That was great, Helen. And I think, you know, to that point, I think a big part is to explain, like Harriet did, right? Why is this work important to you? If leadership is able and willing to do this in a backing it up sort of way, which hopefully we get to that point within that arc that I was referring to. If they're explaining this is why it's important to us, that's part of the modeling you're talking about. That's part of the living the values, because it's no longer than this esoteric philosophical academic thing. It's this is who I am, this is who we are. And I think that's a great start. David, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, second everything that Helen said, particularly about leadership and how the importance of leadership and modeling behavior and values is critical. The thing I would add, and you also said, you talked about values as well, but the thing I would add to both those comments is engagement. That everyone in the organization needs to be engaged in this work in some meaningful way. It has to become part of what they do on a regular basis. You know, it has to be integrated into their work, through not just through the values, but through, you know, process and structure and rewards, and all of those things have to line up behind this, and people have to be given a meaningful role in this. You know, this is where you get into the setting up of employee resource groups or other types of engagement tactics with organizations to help people see themselves in this and see a role for themselves in DEI within their organization. So in addition to leadership, in addition to the values, that engagement piece, I think, is critical.
Thank you, David. All right, coming back.
We also have
Oh, was there another? Oh, sorry.
yeah, we have a question
Oh.
from Ethan.
Ethan.
And,
All right.
he wanted to know if you'd be able to address allyship. It's where Ethan often meets and sometimes he himself feels the most resistance or hesitation, that people who don't identify as anything that usually fits in the DEI frame, but feel strongly about wanting to help and don't know how to step up, especially if there isn't someone who doesn't fit the frame taking the lead. For a non-DEI person to lead a DEI effort can feel like a misfit.
I think it comes to this idea of, what's a white guy doing running a DEI focused organization, right? And the reality is that identity is a lot of things. And Damien just asked, what's a DEI person? I think that this is part of that perception thing on the diversity side, right? With the prior question of what when people say we are not diverse, eh, there's this lane, and I'm repeating myself, but I think it's important in the context of this question, is yes, there is diversity in any group of people by its very nature. But are you representative in the way that you want to be is a different sort of a thing. And I guess part of the question, or my answer to the question, is if not you, then who? Right? So you're gonna wait for whoever that DEI person is to do it. I think that once you start doing this work, Marty was a great example of this yesterday, Marty Lewis, where it's like you get into the space of allyship and advocacy where you are thinking about different kinds of people. And again, this is the learning part of it too, right? You're not speaking for them, you are sharing what you've heard that they have shared with you. And I think that's part of the context here, right? That the more you understand that, I can go through a whole list of identities that I don't have, where I, through my various, listening to people, understand, to the degree that I am aware intellectually of it, not that I've experienced it, right? The concerns of a solo female traveler about checking in a hotel and them not wanting the person checking them in to go, all right, you're in room 332, loudly, to the whole lobby. Like, that makes sense to me conceptually. It's never happened to me. I've never worried about somebody knowing my room number, but like within the process of training to be doing that and to be aware of, how you're going to address that, I think that's the point. And that's why the foundational commitment to me is so important, right? We want to be welcoming to everybody. And then what are the steps that you're going to do to get there? And I think as much as possible, especially in these organizations that do not have in and of themselves those aspects of diversity, which again, a lot of times are race and ethnicity, but can also be disability. They can have nobody within the organization who recognizes or who identifies as having a disability. Well, there are plenty of independent living centers, there are vocational rehabilitation agencies, there are people who are, not geographic specific, who would be more than happy to talk to you and engage with you, some in a paid engagement, some who are just in the advocacy space. Like vocational rehabilitation will give you free free disability trainings for a business at any point, right? So there are so many different resources that you can lean on, where if you yourself are not from that identity, again, that you're sharing, these are the things I heard at this conference, these are the things more anecdotally, but also there's research and resources to be able to do the work. Anything
I was going to say, Ronnie doesn't look like the typical DEI person, right? But he sure is. I think, Ronnie, exactly what you just said. And what David said before, it's about engagement. That's, within an organization. So it's whomever is leading has to be really good at engaging the community and getting people involved as well.
And, to David's point, actually, David, maybe this would be a good time to talk about the organization that you're a part of. the racial justice organization, because I feel like this is exactly, what that's about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm part of a group called White Men for Racial Justice, which was formed a few years ago as an effort to mobilize white men and just an acknowledgement that white men have to be part of this work. I mean, the white men are, in many ways, you could say, white men created this problem. So we have to be part of the solution. I think a lot of this work, we don't demand that white men get involved in, and part of that is maybe, I don't know, driven by low expectations perhaps, but I think it's important that white men are involved in this work. I think that they are critical as allies, and that they have a lot of work themselves to do on themselves in order to be full participants in DEI work. So that's why I'm a part of that organization. It's mobilized hundreds of men, thousands, I think, at this point, across the country to dismantle racial oppression and to do the self work that white men need to do in order to really do this work.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
We're at 2:43. I certainly have more I can share, but it'd be a good time if people have other things they want to ask or say, because we have time to give space to that. Otherwise, we'll be tight on time.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
So I know that you know that we just recently lost our executive director. And so there's two of us in the office now, and our board is in the process of hiring a new director. But for Madeline and I, who are not in that position of doing the interviewing and that kind of things, what are tools that we can do to help make sure we continue steering in the correct direction with when the new person comes on board?
Got it. Thank you. I think part of what I would say is, this is a little sneaky, I guess, and it also depends on what your level of ability is here, which is they're not there yet, right? So you have this opportunity to institutionalize stuff and say, well, this is how we do things. I think that's the key, right? Where there's a difference between, and this is the institutional memory, the muscle memory, the equity part, all of that, which is there's a difference between going, oh, well, the old ED did it this way. Well, you go, well, I'm the new ED, versus, well, this is what we as a team do. Like, that's a harder thing to fight. So while you have this time within your sphere of influence, your scope of influence, like, do the things that you think you could do now, and even, to a greater degree, explain what your intentions are for going forward. So then you now have owned the stuff you're currently doing as this is how we do stuff. And then you also go, well, we're also intending to do these things. And that's a harder thing to fight, right? It's like, then they need to make an argument for why you can't and shouldn't do the things that predated them, which it's a little tough. I mean, maybe they will. And ultimately, when you're not at the top of the food chain, people can get you in wildly different directions, and that's not always great. But that would be my advice given where you're at now, and to whatever degree, even if you can be involved in the process a bit, maybe to have them ask specific questions to just advise or say, hey, maybe ask this or that, because this is what we've talked about as an organization, this is what's important to this team. Yeah, Damien wrote, we've always done it this way. You just go, this is what it is, and then it's on them. But coming back to the interview thing, if you do have any ability to influence that, again, you might not have this, you might not be in the room talking to the people or looking at resumes or whatever, but to be able to just, or even ask more generally, hey, these are things that are important to us. Are you going to get a chance to talk to the candidates about their feelings on it? And worst case scenario, if there is somebody misaligned, you'll be able to be better prepared if somebody can give you some understanding of where the other people's at as well. Damien, did you want to jump in?
No, I like the conversation because I think it's sometimes when you have an individual in a position, it's hard to readjust, what their role is and what they do and how they operate. But when they're not there, it's an opportunity perhaps to set yourselves up, and it should impact, frankly, the search process. Most of the time with search committees, they go based off of a job description, but they don't actually go after what they're really looking for. And so having an honest conversation of the kind of person that you really need to fill that role, again, that's a great opportunity.
Thanks, Damian. And I think to that point, yeah, it's saying, hey, we're really hoping for somebody who might have this expertise or who'd be behind this, whatever. I would say you have nothing to lose by talking to people who are doing that work to say what's important to you. Because in reality, if you're the team that they want to stick around, and with a place that's having turnover, I would hope they would care about keeping the people who are there, then making it clear what's important to you in a healthy environment would be something that they would at least consider in some way. Thank you for the question. Any other questions before I go back to my stuff or comments? All right, how do we avoid tokenizing people? Well, I think the first thing comes back to this general idea of, well, we're not diverse, which a lot of times means that folks are worried that everybody on their staff page is white. So you need to be really careful about, especially for smaller companies, you have to, and organizations, you have to be really careful that that is not the kind of jumping off point, because it's not a good way to set yourselves up for success. If you're bringing somebody in to just to be a BIPOC face, that is literally tokenization. So you need to make sure that you are hiring qualified people. The problem that people are missing in this whole hiring part is that it's about your pool. What you need to be focused on is not necessarily who the candidate is at the end, because yes, you have to hire the best person out of that pool. Your problem, though, as an organization is, or your challenge or whatever, is that you need to make sure that pool is as diverse as possible in as many different ways as possible. So as you're thinking about that part, you need to look at your job descriptions and make sure that the job postings themselves don't have language that are pointing in one way or the other. You need to make sure that you are removing qualifications that are not required that you're claiming are, but you really don't need to have. So you're trying to get rid of barriers in as many ways as possible, and you're letting different folks know through universities, communities and technical colleges, associations. You're building up those relationships to be able to share those job postings. So that's on that part. One question that comes up here is also about representation and marketing material. So again, for those places that are not Detroit, that are not urban centers, that are like, okay, should we show BIPOC and other diverse in various ways people, LGBTQ plus presenting folks, whatever it is, should we put them in these ads because we want them to come? And the thing I would say is that you need to be deliberate about what you're doing here, meaning that the term we use is product readiness. Is the experience that somebody going to reflect what you're putting in your marketing? Because there's an ethical component to this too that goes deeper than just a sort of misleading advertising thing. I think that there's an aspiration to be had, which I respect. And I think that, talking to local communities who are representative of those different groups, to be able to have them featured, to me, feels honest and reasonable. I think it becomes a thing of, if you have, to what Najana brought up before, your whole, marketing materials are all of these different sorts of folks, and one, that's not what they're seeing. That I'm on the fence on. But two, that they're not going to be welcome or have, the experiences looking for. If we think about disability, right? If you can't show up to places and have different experiences, and yet your front cover is somebody who's a wheelchair user, it's not setting yourself up for success, or them for that matter. So I think it's how we avoid tokenizing people is by being deliberate. And then coming back to community is we need to have real relationships with folks, which has come up a bunch of times. If we're talking about specific tourism products, we need to have it focused there. If we are only going to a Black-owned business, which again, I'm picturing kind of less racially and ethnically diverse places, and we're only going to those folks going, hey, we want to feature you because it's Black History Month, that's tokenizing. We need it, or Hispanic Heritage Month, or whatever it is. So there's two parts to this. One, do not lean on people on the tourism product side only for the specific identity celebration around that. That's one. And two, we need self-identification. We need people to be able to say that they are from whatever group that is, that identity, and that they want to be promoted as being a part of it. So we're not making assumptions about them being defined in that way. And we're also not making assumptions that even if they are defined in that way, that they want to be part of the Black History Month thing or Hispanic Heritage or Pride Month or whatever it is. So a lot of this work is really around the relationships and the relationship building. How do we address DEI fatigue? This was a topic that came up a few months ago. There was more kind of, is this done with all the pushback and whatever? Here is what I would say. As an individual, the world can wear us all down, and we need to find ways to replenish, refresh, be around people who make us feel good, take a step away, all of different ways to not be in the thick of this every second, because that's how you get fatigued. Embrace successes. It's really important for us to realize that even the small things matter here. And especially depending on your role, there is only so much you can do. And in an organization that's not necessarily looking at this as broadly and strategically as some of its team are, we really need to make sure that we are recognizing that there is progress and that we're contributing to it. And then as an organization, it's easy to be worn down when you go, what's the point of all this? Again, it's bit by bit. You have to do the work. You have to come up with this kind of blue sky thinking and go, what can we do? And then realize, actually, we can't do all that right now. So come up with what can happen over the next bit, do that, and then check in and go, what are our next set of goals? Don't silo DEI, because as an organization, if we're not making sure that the people who care about this work feel supported and feel like it's part of the broader thing, then they're going to get worn out. And then institutionalizing the change is how we do this whole virtuous cycle. I think we're close to the end. Yeah. All right. So I'll kind of do this lightning round. So to align with the standards, I already mentioned this, publicly and internally commit to DEI. Consider DEI in all aspects of employee life cycle. So how are we thinking about work-life balance? How are we thinking about the fact that somebody has something outside of this? They're not necessarily going to be at this company forever. The places that are anti-professional development because, well, that'll make somebody leave. That's why you need an actual pipeline. People leave organizations. That's part of the life cycle. Talked about this a little. Talked about this a bit. Again, on the accessibility side, but certainly other things too. How are we making sure that there's a consistent experience, but if somebody has a different need, that we're thinking about that? In this case, I'm also thinking about food and dietary restrictions, not drinking alcohol, right? Gluten-free. People get surprised when I say that gluten-free is part of DEI stuff. It's anything that makes somebody's experiences, concerns, etc., different or similar to others. Trainings have come up already. Think about that your vendor relationships. There's a, one big thing to think about here is, let's say you're working with a big organization to do your catering because they're able to do all of it. Well, is there a smaller bakery that can just do the dessert side? Be kind of more creative on how you can give opportunities to different suppliers and vendors. We're not going to do that right now. Lisa, Ami, do you want to read that out?
Sure. Lisa's comment is that we all have a lot of lived experience involving welcoming behavior. How can we make sure this idea of lived experience itself does not unintentionally diminish or even destroy the legitimacy of any work, however incomplete?
Huh. That's an interesting one. How can we make sure the idea of lived experience itself does not unintentionally diminish or however incomplete? Okay. So I this is where we get into this kind of double-edged sword of intent, right? We need to be doing our best that we can all the time, and recognize that when we fall short, it will happen, and that we can't center ourselves when it happens. I think the issue, and Lisa, you can tell me if I'm not answering your question as you're intending, but I think one thing that's important in this is that people sometimes want to be like, well, I wasn't trying to hurt anybody, and then they kind of center themselves in the fact that they feel bad that they hurt someone. It's like, no, you acknowledge that you did it, and then you move on. So we don't have all those lived experiences. We don't know that we're going to be able to do anything. But I think what to be careful on is that incomplete work in some ways can be intent without growth. And intent without growth is not the point of this work. The point of this work is to keep doing better. If you know better, you do better. So it's why we need to keep learning around all this. So again, Lisa, if that wasn't what you meant, feel free to clarify. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap up with ways to work with Travel Unity, and then I'll kick it back to Ami. So if you like conversations like these, we have our Travel Unity Alliance. We have individual and organizational members. We do workshops and do things like that. And we have 3 levels of individual certification. Our baseline is TUIC. It introduces the travel industry, DEI, and DEI in the travel industry. TDP is our manager level certification. And then CDTP is our highest level one, where you create a comprehensive DEI plan for an organization in the travel industry. And then we have the organizational stuff. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Ami, whomever. I'll put my stuff in the chat. And wow, I did not expect that we'd have so many people sticking around so long. So thank you. Very kind of you.
Thank you all so much for attending. If you've been here for all 6 sessions of our virtual summit, or this was the only one you attended, we are so delighted that you've all joined us for these conversations and shared your thoughts in the chat. And we really hope that you will join us in keeping these conversations going by continuing to engage with Travel Unity, whether it's through our industry programming, whether it's participating in our events. Certainly the upcoming awards dinner, we really hope we're able to see a lot of you there. And our CDTP training that's coming up in early November, we've tried to modularize it and create flexible options so it can fit with everyone's schedules and budgets. Brianna, if you could pop that slide up, that'd be super helpful. Just find ways we have lots of ways for everyone to join and support the Travel Unity community. And by participating in sessions like this, you're really doing a lot to help us keep that conversation going. Please expect a survey from us via email before the end of this week. We would love to be able to do more events like this in ways that meet you with the needs that you have, and have conversations that are relevant and resonant to your work and to you personally. So please stay in touch. You've got our contact information and ways to keep those conversations going. Please stay in touch, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd also be remiss if I didn't extend one final thank you to our sponsors. Brandon, if you could pop that up. Thank you so much to Offbeat Travel, Pick LJ, Miles Partnership, Visit Greater Palm Springs, Explore Brookhaven, and Visit Lauderdale. Thank you so much for your support, for helping us do the work that we do, and keep these topics, keep these sessions, keep these forums open and available for us to connect and engage with tough questions and tough topics. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.